Hi, Misha here, and with a new camera, and just because I wanted to, I thought let's revisit Japan's light aircraft carriers. What the US would sometimes call Jeep carriers or escort carriers, they would call light carriers or even light fleet carriers. And I'm not going to go into the history of each and every one of these here. I just thought it would be interesting to point out kind of neat little facts about each one and just kind of compare and contrast them a bit. We have pretty much the main ones here. We have Ryujo, sorry. And then we will have the two sisters of the Zuiho class, Zuiho herself and Shoho. Then we'll have Chiyotos, and then finally Hosho, which, yeah. And what's interesting is, in one way or another, none of these really started off expressly to be light carriers. Well, sort of. But yeah, I just thought it'd be fun to kind of revisit with the new camera and just point out some interesting little facts. So consider this an update, an addendum, if you will. So with that, we will start off with the one for Engelmoss that's the oldest date. We have Ryujo here. And this is as she would launch in 1933. So this was an interesting aircraft carrier. This was the Japanese trying to exploit a loophole in the Washington Naval Treaty that they thought would allow them to make aircraft carriers as long as they were under 10,000 tons. It's a little more complicated than that, but that gets the idea. So the idea behind Ryujo was to have a standard weight of about 8,000 tons, and they hoped they could just crank these out and have little fast escort type carriers that carried about 24 aircraft. So she was laid down in November of 1929. But in 1930, the London Naval Treaty closed this loophole, meaning that Ryujo would be the only one in her class. And with this, the Japanese Navy decided, well, if we only have one, we want to have it carry 48 planes. Well, how do we do this and keep it light? Well, they simply made the hangar deck a double-decker. They went from having one to having two hangars, and nominally increasing. Yeah, you can probably see the problem here already. Anyway, they would commission her in early 1933, and she would quickly go to sea, and they would quickly realize she was super duper top heavy, even in relatively calm waters. Ryujo, by the way, means prancing dragon. So, almost as soon as she entered the Japanese Navy, they started refitting her. They would do lots of changes in kind of a few waves between 1934 and 1936. They would add bulges. They would remove some weight from the top, including some of her aircraft defense. In 1935, in September, while out on maneuvers, she would be caught in the typhoon and have some pretty moderate damage, but thankfully some of the refits had already taken place, so she wasn't totally top heavy. And then, yeah, by 1936, refits were complete, and Japan was no longer really caring about treaties by the end of this. So it didn't really matter that her standard weight had grown to over 10,600 tons, and her full weight had grown to nearly 13,000 tons. But also because of the newer aircraft, mono-wing type thing, she can only carry 37 and then later 34 aircraft, with some of those being spares. She's not especially big, a little over 590 feet. She has a flight deck of about 513 feet, about 75 feet wide. She has 2 hangars, each is about 336 feet. She has 2 elevators, but although her rear is pretty meh, not really useful. She's capable of about 29 knots, so not slug slow, but not the fastest either, not by a long shot. She was an artifact of the whole thing. She was built too light, and they knew it, but they were trying to meet the letter of the law, if not the spirit of the law, and they wanted more carriers. Despite her shortcomings, she did see quite a bit of service in the Second Sino-Japanese War, beginning in August of 1937. Between that time and 1939, she would routinely support operations over China, including over Shanghai, going home occasionally to resupply. And then she would become a training ship briefly, and she would start World War II off by supporting operations over the Philippines, the invasion, and then into 1942 she would first continue supporting various landings in January, and then in March she would do some convoy escorting, and then in April she would do some raiding. And she was there for Midway, but she was part of the northern force that attacked the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, and only had nominal success, not really anything great. She would continue to see use through July, then heading back home briefly, and then she would be caught up in the Eastern Solomons in August. First, planes from Enterprise would spot her and attack her, not really doing any damage, but then planes from Saratoga would take a whack, and they would do damage. They would hit her with 3 bombs and a torpedo. She was on fire, and she quickly went to the bottom. So, she lasted a little longer than some at Midway, but not a whole lot, and that's mostly because she was out of the front line during Midway. Just, really, they did too much, which was a story for a lot of their cruisers and even destroyers in the 1930s. Too light. They wanted too many planes on board. She was just too top-heavy. You know, they gave some effort, but, yeah. It's worth pointing out that she has kind of a cruiser hull. And, really just isn't what we would consider a full aircraft carrier. But because she did carry 48 planes originally, even if they were small biplanes and whatnot that needed a shorter deck, she did blur the line a bit between light carrier and fleet carrier. Yeah, they had a Kagi and Kaga, but she did carry a lot more than Hosho over here, so there is that. It's a neat design just for what it is. The whole double-decker thing is crazy. That's what you kind of would expect. And I like that Eagle Moss did the 1933 configuration before they at least kind of trimmed her back a bit. This is when she was super top-heavy. And with that, we'll move on. Well, here's another way they tried to get around treaty limits with what would be called the Chiotos class. Chiotos herself and Chiyoda. These were originally laid down in 1934 as seaplane tenders. They would carry 24 float planes, seaplanes, and they would be in service before World War II. and even see some action as seaplane tenders. In fact, Chiotos here was at Midway, although she didn't really do anything. She was also converted, given the ability to carry midget submarines in 1941 for some reason. And they continued to be used. Chiotos here was at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942, where she was damaged, so she was laid up for repairs at the end. And then they decided to go ahead and convert her to... Did I mention this video is going to have phone interruptions? I apologize, but there are calls I have to take today. What can you do? Anyway, when they laid these down as seaplane tenders, they configured them such that they could be easily rebuilt, reconfigured to either aircraft carriers or tankers, supply ships. Well, after doing her repairs, they decided to go ahead and build her up as a aircraft carrier. So they tore down the superstructure, gave her a flight deck, and gave her an extended hangar. As a seaplane tender, she already had a hangar, but they made it bigger. And this is not a huge ship. Only about 630 feet long. She's a tad bit slower than Ryusho, at just under 29 knots. Has a crew of about 800. And as an aircraft carrier, it could carry about 30 planes. Now keep in mind, these would be modern World War II planes at least. So a little bit lower capacity than Ryusho, but there it is. So they would rebuild her, reconstruct her, make her better in 1943 because they were in desperate need of aircraft carriers after the losses at Midway and otherwise. Problem. By the time she was officially reclassified as a carrier in November of 43 and then commissioned back into the fleet in January of 44, the Japanese Navy was very short on aircraft and even shorter on trained, skilled pilots. So she ended up being used mostly as a transport and for other things throughout the year until the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, at which time she was dutifully used as a decoy. And at which time both of the sisters of this class were hit multiple times by multiple types of ordnance and quickly sent to the bottom. So all in all, Japan's little trick to have some extra carrier hulls that weren't carrier hulls, that they could easily be made into carrier hulls, didn't work out at all. Plus, by this point, it was quickly being realized that having a carrier that carried 30 planes and whatnot, having lots of, wasn't really the way to go. She just didn't have a lot in the way of facilities. Speed was quite slow by the standards of the mid-war, and at this point, Japan was just too far gone, frankly. I mean, America was now fielding the Essex class, so as American carriers were getting bigger and more capable, with better and better pilots on board them, Japanese are going the opposite direction. Smaller and smaller carriers, kind of hastily converted from other types of hulls, just trying to fill the gap for something they didn't even really need. Next, let's talk about Shoho, Happy Phoenix. This is of the Zuiho class. We're talking about this one first because she was the first to sink, that is. Like Chiotos, this was laid down as something else in late 1934, commissioned, or at least I should say launched in 1936, and ready in 1939. But right as she was about to be commissioned as a submarine tender, they decided to make her into a light carrier. And again, this hull was laid down that it could be converted into a light carrier, an oiler, quite easily. So they decided to do that, and She was commissioned in November of 1941, so right before Pearl Harbor. Fitting out was still kind of going down, though. Even in January, she wasn't complete, but ready. Her first mission was in early February, where she went to truck, bringing supplies, airplanes, and then she would pretty much bounce between truck and Yokosuka that winter and early spring, with her first big mission being the operation that would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. And in the beginning, she wouldn't do so bad. The Shoho here was designed to carry 30 aircraft. She is just under 675 feet long. She's a little slower at 28 knots. Pretty typical, as we'll come to see. 2 elevators, 1 major hangar. Pretty flat top design, no island to speak of, really. And she did okay the first couple of days of the operation, avoiding U.S. attack. But her number ran out. First, Yorktown nearly spotted her, but then got away. But then Lexington would launch aircraft against her. And then on May 7, Shoho here would actually be the first Japanese carrier to be sunk in the war. Of course, America would lose Lexington, which is, pound for pound, a larger aircraft. But it was the first Japanese carrier to go down, and a sign of things to come just a month later at Midway. And so that's kind of why Shoho is famous. This model here, of course, is 1942, because she was only operational for, not even 4 months. And really, that was the Battle of the Coral Sea was her only military engagement, combat front line. So definitely probably not worth converting, especially considering they started making her way back at the end of 1934. So with that said, what about her sister? As for Suiho herself, she was actually originally laid down in June of 1935, so about half a year after the ship that would become Shoho. However, she was converted into an aircraft carrier a little bit earlier, so she was actually functional in operation and commissioned by 1941. She's basically the same, about 675 feet long, top speed of about 28 knots, carried 30 aircraft, and originally had a flight deck of about 590 feet, with one big hangar that was a bit over 400 feet. She was not there at the Battle of the Battle of Pearl Harbor, but she was assigned to kind of cover the fleet as it returned home to kind of give it some protection. And she would be used on and off in 1942. Probably most notably, she was damaged at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. She was hit by a couple of 500-pound bombs. Knocked her flight deck out, but she was able to get back home, and she was back in service by the end of 1942. And she spent most of 1943 and the first half of 1944 alternating between being a troop transport, a cargo freighter, and an aircraft tug, usually with her flight group being detached. And that's something I didn't mention. With Shoho, too, they were having an aircraft shortage even before Midway. For example, when Shoho was lost, she was not at all at full capacity. She only had about 24 aircraft on board, if even that. And Juiho was much in the same position. But they decided to try to bring her to full strength in 1944. They reorganized. She actually would operate with Chiotos and Chiyoda, the other light cruisers. And they would be a major part in the Battle of the Philippine Seas come June. But of course, that would also be the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While Zuiho would be damaged, she would escape pretty unscathed, all things considered, but her flight group would just be decimated. Young, untrained pilots and what have you. It is worth pointing out that in 1943 they would update her air defense, and actually eventually in 1944 they would give her rocket batteries. And they would also extend her flight deck forward here a bit. I've looked and looked to see the official length. I don't know. Originally, like I said, it was about 590 feet. It's extended forward quite a bit. So, well over 600 feet on the flight deck, which makes sense for the newer aircraft, so she could operate some of the newer bombers and what have you. So she would get back from the Battle of the Philippine Sea, of course needing repair and refit that summer, and would pretty much remain in home waters until October and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she, like the others, was used as a decoy. And these carriers had very few aircraft on board, again just to be used as a decoy, and a very ineffective one at that. Essentially, the Japanese Navy just threw them away. She would sink relatively early on the morning of October 25th, 1944. Originally, she would try to get some aircraft in the air, but a bomb would hit her deck, again knocking it out. And kind of yet again proving this whole converted aircraft carrier thing, it wasn't working out the way they had hoped. Even if the boats themselves were good, they didn't have planes, and if they had good planes, they did not have trained pilots by this point. So with that, we've got 4 out of 5 we've lost here. But we still have one more, and she was the original IJN carrier. By the way, the name Zuiho means lucky phoenix, which I suppose she was more lucky than Shoho, happy phoenix. There you go. And for our final vessel, we have Hosho, phoenix or flying phoenix. Not only the first aircraft carrier in the Japanese Navy, but really the first true aircraft carrier commissioned in the world. As is oft repeated, yes, HMS Hermes, which was built specifically to be a carrier, was laid down before, but Hosho here was launched and commissioned before. And this dates back to 1918, so the tail end of World War I, when the Japanese government, the budget, authorized a seaplane tender, a seaplane carrier. Mainly for float planes, kind of what we've seen before. So originally, even she wasn't really meant to be a carrier. But by 1919, seeing British operations with HMS Argus, and with the end of World War I, they decided, hey, let's try out this newfangled carrier concept. So they changed her and gave her a flight deck, and planned for her to operate 15 aircraft. And originally, she was going to have a top speed of 30 knots, which would have been pretty good. But they decided that actually, in this case, slower was better, so they limited it to 25 knots with the design. And they kind of had it laid down, ready to go. The design, and they laid her down at the end of 1920, launched her in November of 1921, and commissioned her at the end of 1922. Now, Hosho was to have a sister, Shakoku, but she was canceled before she was even laid down because of the Washington Naval Treaty and other things. Of course, Shokaku would appear much later as a carrier in World War II, but rather different design. Instead, Hosho here was to be used as kind of an experiment. Practice takeoff and landings, carrier operations, figure out what did and didn't work. For example, early on she had an island, but they would delete that in 1923. They would also remove her crane and some other gear from the deck to try to streamline it for pilots. Not a very big carrier, really. Originally, the flight deck was a little over 550 feet. The Zuihos over here would displace about 11,200 tons standard and about 14,200 tons full. But little Hosho here was about 7,400 tons standard and about 9,400 tons full. But she did serve. They used her throughout the 1920s, experimenting. They would kind of send her out on a cruise with pilots. They would kind of get what did and didn't work. So she went through lots of minor refits and updates, especially to like her arrestor gear and stuff. But then in 1928, she would join Akagi and start operating a bit. And really her first combat would come in 1932 during the Shanghai incident. She would operate alongside Akagi and then later Kaga in 1932 and 33, even having her fighters support their bombers. She had an interesting deck arrangement or hangar deck. She had about a 220-foot front deck meant for fighters, and she had a pretty small but double-decker rear hangar deck. It was about 50 feet by 50 feet. But again, a double-decker, and that was, they thought, may be good for torpedo bombers, because dive bombers really didn't exist at the time. And maybe reconnaissance planes, but later they would assign these to cruisers. So she would operate in China. She would also, like Ryujo, get caught in 1935 during the typhoon and get a little bit of damage, so she would go in for refit and repair in 1936. She would go into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, and then she would hand off her air group to Ryujo in 1937-38, going back home for another little refit, and then she would be used as a training ship for a time. And after that, she would be there at Pearl Harbor, again, like Ryujo, kind of hanging in the back, supporting the main group, the battleships, as they made their way back home. She mostly would use her planes for scouting and anti-submarine patrols. But this time, her original complement of 15 was pretty well down to about 11 because of the newer aircraft. But she was still able to operate some of them. But a study had been conducted before the war. She was given the latest A5M, the Claude, but they tried to see if she could fly the A6M, and it just wasn't happening. So the A5M was pretty much the best she could do. So after she was used for a second time as kind of a distance support and scout aircraft carrier for Midway, after that she would return to home waters and be used as a training vessel throughout 1943 and 44. And that's pretty much where she would stay. She would never really be used for frontline combat again. She would be given a new paint job in 1944, which is this model here. They would also lengthen her flight deck by about 20 feet in each direction, so it was actually a bit over 590 feet. And they would try to give her modern crash barrier equipment and gear, which was great. Maybe she could operate newer aircraft, at least in a training role. But the problem is all this weight made an already light hull just that much more unstable. So after the refit in 1944, she really could not go out except in the gentlest of gentle oceans. And thus, 1945, she would spend mostly in port at Kure, where she would be damaged a few times during bombing attacks, but she would not only survive the war, she would actually have a post-war career. So yay, one of these actually survives. She would be used as a transport, bringing Japanese soldiers and some civilians home. First, she would be used just kind of as she was in September, October, but then at the end of 1945, they would actually modify her, cutting back her flight deck and everything and redoing her hangar deck so she could carry more people safely. And she would take back out in 1946, finally completing her 9th and final run at the end of August of that year. And she would bring roughly 40,000 Japanese citizens home. So for repatriation. So after this very honorable post-war career, she would be handed over for scrapping, which would be completed by 1947. So at least one of these light carriers actually lived through the war. So yeah, with the new camera, still kind of practicing with it. And I know in my original videos, some of these kind of got mixed around. It's a bit of a funny story. But anyway, I thought I'd do them in the right order and everything. It's, obviously the big carriers like Kaga, Akagi, Shokoku, Teiho will get the glory. But these little light carriers were just as important. And I'm really glad that Eagle Moss has done them. So with that, I thought I would just kind of revisit. I don't know, Hosho or Shoho are probably my favorites just because of their place in history. Which one do you like? And with that, I will let you go. If you could, as always, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.